Now that we learned a lot about structs, I want to dive into a slightly more realistic demo project so that we can repeat what we learned and practice what we learned. Definitely feel free to pause the videos from time to time to try out the next steps on your own. That will be a great exercise, but definitely also feel free to just follow along. Now, what we'll build is a notes-taking app that will use a struct for storing some note data, but will not just store the note data in a struct in memory whilst the application is running. Instead, we'll also store our note data in a Node.json file. So a file that stores data in the JSON format, which looks like this. So that's what we'll build. And for that, I'm in a brand new empty folder, an empty project. And as a first step, I'll run go mod init and give this a path of example.com/note. And with that, we can get started working on that. Now I will get started by adding a main.go file. And of course, as you learned, this does not have to be named main. In most sections thus far, I did not use main as a name here, but it must be part of the main package, because this should be my main entry point for this application. And therefore, of course, we also need that main function, as you learned. Now, my goal with that application is to ask the user for the data that should be stored in a node, and then this data should be written to a file. Therefore, as a first step in this main function, we should get that user input for that node. And I'll write a helper function that helps me get that input, which I'll name getUserInput, where I want to get the prompt that should be shown to the user in the command line as an argument, as a parameter of type string, and where we can then use the format package, which of course must be imported therefore, to output this prompt, and where we then of course also use the format package with the scan method here to get the user input. For that, I'll add a helper variable called value, which will be of type string, and I'll pass a pointer to that variable to scan, and then it's this value which I want to return. For that, of course, we must make it clear that a value will be returned by getUserInput, and I'm doing this by adding this return type. We can actually also get a bit more fancy here and check if value is an empty string, so if the user did not enter anything, and I'll use scanLN instead of just scan, so that the user can theoretically hit enter to confirm an empty input. And if we got an empty value, I want to either return a default value, or we added this function such that it potentially gives us an error, and I'll go for that approach. So we'll return two values where the second value is this potential error. And I'll therefore return an empty string as a value for the input, but more importantly, I'll create and return an error with help of the errors package, which also must be imported if we have an empty input. And here we can use that new function to create such a new error value. And then here I'll say invalid input. And you could of course say whatever you want. Here, if we do have a valid value, I'll return nil as a value for the error. With that, we got this utility function, and back in main, we can now get the user input here. And I want to get two pieces of input for the node that's going to be stored here. I want to get the title of the node and the content that should be stored. So therefore here I'll say node title, and then I'll call getUserInput again and say node content. And in this application, by the way, we'll only manage a single node, because we haven't really learned yet how we could work with a list of nodes, but we will of course learn about list data later in this course. Here it will be a single node which should have a title and a content, and therefore I'll store these values in variables like this. which will later end up in our struct, but of course we could also get an error here. For both inputs, we could get an error if the user entered nothing. Therefore, I also want to check if error is not equal to nil, and if that's the case here, I simply want to return and exit out of this application. I also want to output the error message though, with println. So I'll println the error. And then we can repeat that here for the second user input we got. Now, of course, we could also outsource this into a separate function to keep the main function lean. And we could add a function called getNodeData, where I paste in that code I just wrote. And the idea here simply is that getNodeData will take care about this error handling and about calling getUserInput, and will then just return the two string values which we have here, the title and the content, if everything worked. However, we should also return an error here, since this of course could also fail if one of these if checks here becomes active. So we might want to return the error here if we have an error, and return empty string values for the first two return values in that case, and do the same down here. But if we don't make it into one of these if blocks, we can instead return the title and then the content and then nil for the error. And with that in the main function, we can get the title and the content and potentially an error by simply calling getNodeData. Now, if you want to put this into a separate function or not is entirely up to you. Here, I did it just for demonstration purposes. And now here, I of course want to check if we got some error, in which case I still want to return, and in which case I also still want to output that error. But now I only have one if check here in the main function because I outsourced the other logic into a separate function, therefore keeping my main function a bit leaner. And with that, we are getting the input we need for this application. Now, as a next step, we can start working on that node struct that should store that data.